Welcome back to the Irresistible Community as we round out chapter 3 of Ephesians today. What we'll find that's interesting is that Paul uses all kinds of purpose statements in this passage, and it kind of comes down to the really simplistic idea that the Ephesians, his hope for them, his prayer for them, is that they might really know the love of God, and that they might have assurance of God's love for them, but also their relationship, their new status as Gentiles who have been converted to a faith that has Jewish roots. He wants them to have confidence in their faith that Christ is within them, that God's power, His strength is within them. And I just want you to listen. Every time that there is a that or a so that, there is a purpose clause. In Greek, it's called a hina clause, and it means in order that. And so it introduces this new idea. And what's interesting is that Paul begins in this passage, I'll kind of give you a quick summary. He begins in this passage with a prayer. He's saying, I bow my knee before the God who is the Father of all families of earth. And so you see this unity, Jewish and Gentiles all coming together under the umbrella of God as the Father of all ethne, of all ethnicity. And he prays to God, the Father of all people, in order that. And so in verses 3:14 through 19, we find several purpose statements built on top of each other. This is why I'm praying to God. This is what I hope to be the result of my prayer. And what's interesting is that I would like for you as a group to go ahead and read those verses 14 through 19. But in Greek, this is one sentence. This is one really long sentence with ideas that are just compounded over and over again. And so as I've said before, Ephesians is a really dense letter to read. And so you could really spend the rest of the evening in your group just slowly reading through Ephesians and picking out every word and every idea that's coming out. But I think what's most significant and most beneficial to talk about in the time that you have are the purposes that Paul discusses. And so every time that there's a that or a so that, a so that, I'll kind of point at you. And that way you can maybe make a mark in your Bible. And I'm reading from the New American Standard version of the Bible. And so here we go. For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father. And so we have to look back. For what reason? Everything in chapter 3, verses 1 through 13. This is the reason. It's Paul's willingness to make sacrifices to preach the gospel to the Gentiles so that they might know the good news of Jesus' resurrection. For this reason, verse 14, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. So that, in order that, He would grant you, according to the riches of His glory, to be strengthened with power through His Spirit in the inner person. In order that, so that, Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints, including Jews and Gentiles, what is the breadth? And so we get some dimensions here. What is the breadth? What is the length? The height and the depth. You know, the song Deep and Wide that we sing as children. That's kind of maybe where the idea of the song came from. What is the breadth, length, height, and depth of God's love? And to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. Now there might be a little play on words here, because there's an interesting thought here, an interesting question that I've kind of raised in reading this. In the very last clause it says, so that, another purpose statement, you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. Now we tend to read the Bible so fast. We tend to read it with all of these ideas floating around in our mind, our head, that we just don't take the time to ask what it actually means. Think about it for a second. What does it mean To be filled up to all the fullness of God. And be careful what your answer is. Think about it. That sounds pretty interesting. To be filled up to all the fullness of God. Now, something that might be at play here is that there is a cult in the Greco-Roman world called the Gnostic cult. And basically, Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. So whenever a doctor diagnoses, you got the Greek preposition dia, which means through, knowledge, because of knowledge possibly, is the other way that the preposition functions. So through knowledge, you come to a conclusion about someone's health. So we've got this word gnosis here in verse 19. To know the love of God which surpasses gnosis. Maybe surpasses Gnosticism. That you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. Now what's interesting is that the basic tenets of Gnosticism was that they would be filled with knowledge. The Greek word pleroma is this idea of receiving special knowledge and being filled with that knowledge. It's not knowledge that is available to all people. It's not like knowledge that's in a book and you just have to have really great reading comprehension to read it and understand what it's saying. But it's knowledge that is given to individuals in the Greco-Roman world from divine beings. Special knowledge. And whenever they receive that knowledge, they're liberated from the physical world, as they believe that the physical world was evil, matter was evil, and that spirituality was good. And I could go into all the details of why they believe this. They basically believed that there was an evil being that created the physical world and took spirits and made them captive into physical bodies. And so this special knowledge would liberate the spirits from their bodies. Obviously, Paul being Jewish, this would be very different from Jewish theology, but he's also a Roman citizen, and so he would have been really well acquainted with these ideas of Gnosticism. And this would have been proto-Gnosticism, an early generated idea of Gnosticism. So, Paul would have been familiar with this, and possibly, because he's writing to a Gentile audience, he's kind of making this comparison here. That the love of Christ surpasses knowledge. And so what is the significance here? Well, the significance is that the love of God has an inclusive scope. The love of God is extended to every human being, regardless of their ability to comprehend. The love of God is not exclusive. God doesn't give his love to certain elite individuals. God gives his love to all people. And so that's why God's love surpasses knowledge. That's why his argument is Christianity, the way of Jesus, as it's called in the first century. We read that in the book of Acts. The way of Jesus surpasses, is more gracious, more beneficial, more generous to humanity, to the world, than Gnosticism